I grew up on a university college campus, and there were lots of other teachers that had kids similar age. So we just grew up as a pack of kids on a university campus. My brother was building a game from a coding perspective. I do all the interface works, and we're up to 300 million users in like one market. It was just like insane scale. So how many robots are there going to be? I don't know. How many robots are there now? And then they realized that children were scared of the robot going up and down. The great thing is DroneDeploy has, grown its revenue year on year significantly since we joined them. What's more of a human is ChatGPT. That's way more of a human. This robot is like not a human. That's super dumb. The only question with humanoid robots is because of their physical form factor, it is going to freak people out. If you think how long it took Boston Dynamics to get to Spot, it was 30 years,
This is Mark Pavlikovsky, and welcome to the TechMates podcast, where my partner Henrik and I explore how Kiwi and Aussie founders are reshaping the future and what sets them apart. Henrik and I have been part of successful companies in Silicon Valley and Europe, and now bring that expertise to partner with entrepreneurs in Australasia. By sharing the personal stories of successful Kiwi and Aussie founders and how they got here, we hope to inspire you to dream big. This is TechMates, bringing an outsider's perspective to the stories of those daring to disrupt down under. Let's dive in.
All right, Dave, thank you so much for joining us on TechMates.
Well, it's good to be here, guys.
Awesome. Well, we met a few weeks ago on a road trip through New Zealand, which has been super exciting. And yeah, we got to know you quite a lot already since we spent some time in the car together. But for our audience, we want to kind of go back to your childhood, where you grew up. You grew up in South Africa and then migrated to New Zealand at some point. So would love to start there, actually. So you grew up in Cape Town or near Cape Town, is that correct?
Near Cape Town, near Stellenbosch, a little area called Somerset West, which was a pretty awesome upbringing. I grew up on a university college campus, and there were lots of other teachers that had kids similar age. So we just grew up as a pack of kids on a university campus. It was absolutely stunning. I think that kind of freedom in upbringing is often a trait of, that kind of creates entrepreneurs, because you kind of create your own path rather than, very well formed paths.
Yeah. So as a child, you had a lot of freedom to run around, do your thing, have explored your surroundings.
Very much so. And it was on the side of a mountain, and pretty much could, round up a few friends and go climb the mountain. And, I grew up catching snakes, and I had a whole collection of snakes at home and those kinds of things, which is, just like this idyllic kind of rural environment that I was able to grow up in. It was pretty specifically architected. My parents wanted that for us as kids. And you don't really know how unique it is when you're growing up in that environment. But looking back, it was such a cool place to grow up.
We were telling me earlier was that it was a pretty, the time during South Africa's history is pretty tumultuous, but you actually were shielded from that by being on a university campus, right?
Yeah, it was a multicultural campus, which was quite rare, for that stage. So from that perspective, it was good that I had, a slightly integrated environment in which I actually got to grow up. But yeah, the campus itself was pretty safe. Our parents were never worried about us roaming around on the campus during the day. It wasn't like there was heavy security or anything like that. It was just rural enough that it just really wasn't a target or a significant problem. Obviously, there were much more dangerous places to grow up in South Africa at that stage. I think my decision eventually to move to New Zealand really wasn't around, safety and security at that point. It was wanting to go overseas and work overseas like many New Zealanders do, going to London. And I still absolutely love South Africa, and, always wish I could spend more time out there.
Yeah, tell us more about maybe how that whole decision to leave South Africa came about. Where were you at that time in your life? I guess were you post-university?
Yeah, so I'd actually, so I started studying in South Africa in a place called Stellenbosch, which was probably only 20 minutes from where I lived. I started doing computer science, and I originally wasn't actually a hardcore programmer in high school. My brother had already, was a hardcore programmer in high school, and was probably a heavy influence on me being involved in kind of, in the computer industry. But my focus was really much more around creating things with computers. So it was much more on the media side. It was video production, or if my brother was building a game from a coding perspective, I do all the interface work. So it was much more around design. And I think what was happening at that stage, we also look back and say there was, Macromedia was there at that stage with things like Flash was coming out. And there was this introduction of creating dynamic interactive environments for designers for the first time, rather than just being a coder. And those heavily influenced me to learn to code, because suddenly you could create much more interactive, fun things by learning coding. And the first coding environment I actually learned in was something called POVRay, which is a ray tracing engine. So if you actually scripted the code correctly, you could do ray tracing to build 3D worlds. And so that was the easy way to actually do it. At that stage, you could build animations using code and then doing a lot of Flash development. And kind of late high school, early university days, I had some friends that worked at ad agencies and they were interested in how do you build websites. And their customers were saying, hey, we need website development work. And so I kind of got into the industry through that. I'd actually produced some websites with this agency, and that person was actually looking at doing a startup with another colleague in South Africa, and they said, hey, do you want to join us? And at that stage I was kind of mid my first year of university and definitely loved the computer science side of things, but on the flip side, I also the whole structured university education thing was, it just felt like you were so many years away from actually doing what you knew you wanted to do that I left at the end of my first year and joined that company, which was my first entrepreneurial venture.
Wow.
At a very young age, at 19, I was basically involved, had some shareholding, was a director of a very early stage company. At that stage, doing software and website development. That company evolved over the years, and this is kind of late 90s. So it really was when, that kind of software, the world was our oyster. There were very few people with skill sets to do creative and technology things. There was quite a high level of demand for those kind of capabilities. Yeah, and just spent, a few years just mastering the tooling, mastering skills around interaction with customers. And the CEO of that company was just incredible and pushed me to just do everything. So if a customer was coming in, even at 19, he'd be like, well, Dave, go and meet the customer and get the requirements and build the software. And so you just accepted that was normal rather than having to go to a big corporate and then wait 20 years before, you had access to all of these opportunities. So I was
All
given
right.
I was given responsibility very young. I embraced the responsibility and loved it very young. It was such a good kind of training ground for future careers.
Wow.
What did your parents think about you dropping out of
Yeah, well,
university?
my father is a professor and my mum's a
Yeah.
teacher, and they were very supportive, surprisingly. You always have this terrifying moment of, what's going to happen. But no, I think they were always, always say like the one thing they taught me was to think for myself. So they had to kind of double down on that. It's like, great, well, you've got to set your own path. I think many years later, my mum admitted she was terrified, just like wondering like, okay, let's see where he goes. So I think like every parent would be. But yeah, I've no regrets. I eventually went back to university and have varying opinions on how good or bad it is for your path. But yeah, I definitely followed the right path and had some great experience I would not have had I completed my degree.
So you did go back to university.
Yeah, I eventually did a postgrad diploma in business and then a master's in business, and just kind of got away with skipping the undergrad program.
Was that in South Africa?
No, that was in Auckland University.
So how did so okay? So you joined this company at 19. You basically are like running their tech. You're like CTO basically, right? And how long? So how long did you do that for? Like what? And what were the big? So like you learned like that this stuff was like super exciting, right? Because it's like new technology. Plus you're just like given a lot of responsibility. You can do whatever you want. Like just make it work. Or the big kind of like takeaways?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing there was it just kind of leveled the playing field in terms of your brain's ability to realize that you can do anything. So when you are that young and you get the access to just do a company, at that stage, the CEO was equipped to actually start and self-fund the business. And it's not like we had to go and raise capital or have a specific, he had a vision for what he wanted, and I got to jump on that bandwagon and help them as a business. Yeah. So I think for me, I didn't realize the level of responsibility I had at the time. It was just normal. It was just, hey, go do this, go figure this out. And I think the one thing I realized is that I had this very, very strong fire inside of me that just really wanted to make a company like that successful. And what I found was I kind of had three skill sets. I had this design background, and then I had the technology background. I could code and do design. And then I actually didn't really realize how strong the commercial side was appealing to me at that point. I think working with customers and working with the CEO and those types of skill sets. And so I think what happened was I landed up with this kind of Venn diagram overlap of design, technology and commercial. And I think there's always been a tension. I probably gave up the design quite early in my career. And then I've kind of rolled through CTO roles and, with Rokos taking on the CEO role. And I think now I'm definitely leaning much more into the commercial side than the technology side. But I think, in terms of my personal superpowers, it's not that I necessarily am better than everyone else on any of those spectrums. It's the fact that I'm strong at all three, and that overlap actually just gives me an advantage in terms of creativity and building product and, working with customers and things like
Yeah,
that.
the guy, I think Scott Adams is his name, the guy who makes a Dilbert cartoon. He has this kind of idea of like skill stacking, where like maybe you're like the best, maybe you're like in the top, I don't know, 20% of the world at like design, but then if you add like, I don't know, technology, and you're still maybe the best in the world, 20% of the world at that, but like together, you're in the top 10% now because like the overlap of people. So when you add like another stack of just like being commercial, it's like maybe then you're top 1% of the world skill wise.
And I think in your early 20s, you're working, ridiculous hours. There's so many times I left the office at 4 a.m. and was back in the office at, 8, 9 a.m. You're relying on your skill set and building, getting your thousands of hours of experience and building that. And I think as you grow through your career, you do realize that you're probably not the 10 out of 10, a specific thing that you need, but you understand that job, you know what the capabilities and requirements are. You can spot really good talent. And so you basically build on that and say, hey, I can communicate with all of my staff and I understand everything that all of the staff are doing, but you really want to create a great team around you. So you immediately go and hire better people than when you do a startup, and then you basically support them in their specific discipline. But you've got this systems thinking approach where you can integrate the work that's happening across your business very easily. It can all fit in your head at the same time from that perspective.
That's cool. It's funny because your story actually closely mirrors Philip Ferlinger. We spoke to him on the podcast earlier from Upstock. I mean, before he was a co-founder of Zero, but now he's founded Upstock. And he also similarly in the US, like got interested in computers quite early with his brother, and started doing kind of like basically consulting for like some of these design agencies, building websites. They did something for the Beastie Boys. And then, that sort of like launched him on this path of just like creating technology. So it's kind of cool, like during that time, it feels like if you were there at the right time. I mean, how do you think about that today? Like, do you feel like, that window has like shut, or do you feel like there's always opportunities at every kind of period in time for like the kids today who are like, the 19-year-old today who's like looking around and thinking about what to do?
I mean, as an entrepreneur, the default answer is, of course, there's always opportunities. And I think there's multiple opportunities. I don't think it's just the obvious. Obviously, we're heavily invested in the tech track, and we'd be saying things like, oh, it's AI right now, or it's robotics right now, or something like that. I think even outside that space, there's tons and tons of opportunities all the time. I think the only challenge is you don't necessarily know when that phase is happening, exactly what the valuable part of that phase is. At the moment, you might think, oh, well, maybe my next startup should be an AI company. And then you go, oh, well, that's, quite threatening in terms of, what are the foundational companies going to do? And are they just going to, leapfrog all of the startups that actually try build on top of their frameworks, or is AI like the fabric, like the internet was, and it's about leveraging the fabric to solve a specific vertical problem for a customer. So I think those things always become obvious in hindsight, and so we'll know in a few years' time and look back and say, the obvious signs were there that was going to take place. And I think that was happening in the 90s with the internet. It wasn't clear. It wasn't clear that e-commerce was going to be a thing. I mean, there was this massive phase in the early 2000s with content management, and everyone was building a content management system. This idea of it's not hard coded, it's in the database. Everyone came up with the same idea at the same time. So the question now is, a lot of people are piling into AI. So obviously there's a lot of opportunity there, but tech evolution means that most of them will fail, like creating really big companies, and a few of them will do incredibly well out of it. So yeah, and I think you do get better over time, having seen these waves, just realizing that they open the opportunities, open and close for doing various things. So yeah, there's always opportunities opening up, and a lot of it's to do with how embedded are you, how connected are you really. And I think people also think it's like, well, how connected are you with the technology? But I think, most people would say technology doesn't make you money, solving customer problems does. So the question really is which customer problems, and are you connected with that now you know enough about the technology that it can actually solve some problems that have always existed that this technology can suddenly now solve. And I think that's harder than people think with AI. There's so many software companies sitting around that are 10 years old, 20 years old, and it's not obvious for them how to apply AI. They all say it's obvious and they're putting something out there, but they're all testing. They're trying to figure it out right now.
Yeah. One mental model that I personally have, I don't know how you think about this, but in an environment where like, it's really hard to kind of pick a horse or understand which horse to back. personally, like just follow your curiosity. At least for me, that's sort of something has proven to be like a good heuristic. If like if this is interesting to you, there's probably something there. Explore more.
I think if you don't follow that course, you run out of energy as an entrepreneur. I think your energy is very internally based. I always talk about entrepreneurs thrive despite their environment, not because of their environment. And there's a lot of anecdotes about saying to an investor, oh, I'm looking for really good people to inspire me. And the investor will say, well, if you need good people to inspire you, you really shouldn't be an entrepreneur. That really has to be kind of baked in. And as you say, that baked in inspiration is not everywhere. It's going to be down certain paths, and it'll include certain components. Like there's certain characteristics of startups that I really enjoy working with really, great people. I love working with internationally with multiple cultures. I love all of those kind of characteristics. So always look for those. Yeah, so I think following your passion doesn't necessarily land you in a viable business, though. That's the other problem. So you're always tuning to like, hey, in this body of research of things I'm fascinated by, is there some evidence that one of these paths is more viable than another? And I would definitely say if I look at my track record, I don't necessarily optimize for the most money you can make possibly. There's plenty of businesses, you're not going to do a deep tech startup or a robotics startup if, you're purely optimizing for best possible chance I'm going to be a billionaire. So I think for me, it's more a question of, what domain experience do I have historically that's well unique? And then what is a trend over the next 5 to 10 years with some level of certainty is going to pay off. And I think that we're all willing to make a bet on. It's like, hey, if it doesn't hit over this time frame, and hey, that was the bet we all made, including the investor. But yeah, for me, it has to be something I'm personally passionate about to get into.
So if you were 19 again now and kind of dropping out of university or whatever, so what field would you get involved in now?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should have just enjoyed myself and done 3 years of university. I always feel robbed of that experience looking back. It's like, I missed out on that aspect. It probably gave me 10 years of business experience because I had done that. So I was always kind of like a decade ahead from that perspective.
It's funny, like the grass is always greener, right? Like
yeah, totally. You just do something different. I think I was lucky enough to be in the internet industry. So what better course could I have been on, in the late 90s and early 2000s? I think being in South Africa at that stage, the world wasn't flat from a access perspective. You couldn't imagine being in Silicon Valley. Even coming to New Zealand, the startup scene wasn't as strong in the early 2000s. There's many organizations now that really just flatten the earth for most New Zealand tech startups. It's like, hey, you should go talk to some tech, VCs in the Valley. It's just part of your due diligence of should you even be doing this startup, because it's one flight away and you're going to get some great information and we can help you get a meeting. So that really wasn't accessible. So I think the longer I spent in New Zealand in the ecosystem, it was really just that idea of realizing how small the world is and how accessible everyone is in the world. In New Zealand, they talk about a small, ecosystem, and you're only 1 degree of separation. You can get a meeting with the Prime Minister if you need it. But I think that actually holds pretty much in the tech industry globally. You can access the right people. And I think one of the bubbles that was popped for me is I think people always think like, oh, if you have a good idea and you meet enough investors of the top investors, you'll raise money. And I think that quantity actually turned out to be not true. When you start working in more and more specialized areas, like in the US, you realize you're actually looking for you're actually looking for fewer and fewer investors that are deeply specialized in your area. That's very hard to know in the early days. You kind of just think they're all the same. They're just looking for a great startup. It's like, no, this one's looking for software only, one market. This one's looking for legal stuff. This one's looking for robot stuff, And I think once you know that, then they're much more interested in talking to you because you're talking their language. And they also think there's very few of you around. So they're more than happy to have that conversation. So I think, yeah, if you think about like what I would give my kids that I didn't have, it's like, how do you flatten the world and say, hey, as part of your education in high school and university, if you do that or not, hopefully they do, it's like, do you expose them to international conference and, like somebody that's the top 5 of the world, just have a car ride with somebody that did this better than everyone else in the world. And then they just realize like that's accessible. So just raise the bar in your mind and you can go and do that. So I think that was a valuable learning.
Yeah. And so take us back to, the early 2000s in New Zealand in the startup scene. So you arrived, I think, around 2000, 2001 in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Why did that whole trip be like? Why did you even come to New Zealand? Maybe go back a little bit.
Yeah, so my partner at the time, parents were in New Zealand, and so we wanted to come out here and spend some time out here, and actually landed in Palmerston North. And having done tech stuff in Cape Town, landing in Palmerston North, I hadn't done the research on, where is the tech scene happening in New Zealand. It was more a question of let's go to New Zealand, and so then you start looking at the tech scene at that time in Palmerston North, and that wasn't particularly big. So I kind of knocked on the door of the one company that I had skill sets that was useful for and said, look, I'm going to work for you. And, over the next few weeks, you can decide if you want to pay me or not, because you're it.
Wow.
And that was Rex Software, right?
Yeah, that was correct. So that company started off as a web development company. Very quickly, I started doing some work in Wellington. And then eventually, within a few months, I was like, look, growing up in Cape Town, you were never in Johannesburg. And at that stage, Johannesburg was really the powerhouse for business. And so I thought, look, if I'm going to make the move to New Zealand, get to the business capital of New Zealand, which is really Auckland. So at that stage, really made the move there with that company and opened up the Auckland office for that business, really focused on content management software for that business. So, and obviously never looked back. And now I live in Tauranga and I love it here. It's really about giving my younger kids the opportunity to have quite a rural upbringing. But, I was in Auckland for 20, 25 years, and that was awesome. What a great ecosystem there.
Yeah, and so you had different roles in different companies in Auckland over the last 20 years, let's say. How did you see the ecosystem growing up? I mean, I guess in the early 2000s, there wasn't much connection to Silicon Valley. That has changed. Maybe you can talk
Yeah,
a little.
that's definitely changed. Yeah, I think for me, it was leaning more and more into the product side of things. So I think in your early tech career, there's always this tension between could you bootstrap your company as a services business and could you build a product as a services business? And then slowly you become a product company. And I think I very quickly learned that that's a much harder path than people think, because you're wired to be a services business. And so you're always tempted to take a customer's money if they're willing to pay for something. All these evil incentives exist in services companies to stop them being product companies. So you potentially land up being a bad services company because you're trying to build some product, but you also become a bad product company because you're continuously accepting services. And so very quickly, it was evident that you really need a pick, and at that stage, it was really product was, a very strong focus of mine. I'm a builder. I love building stuff, physically, software wise. And then the question, of course, is, well, how do you have the privilege of building stuff if you haven't got $10 million in your own bank account to fund it? And the ecosystem was growing pretty rapidly in Auckland in particular, and angel investment and seed investment. And yeah, I was lucky enough that while I was studying university, I met up with a company that was called VMob, which became Plexure, and they were looking for a CTO for that business. And that was really my first kind of like venture funded kind of, you've got a whole bunch of money. How many million do you need to set up a tech team and actually build a product in that ecosystem?
And this must have been like one of the very first venture funded companies in New Zealand, right? Probably.
I think there were others, but yeah, I mean, it was, very, very, very passionate CEO, a very experienced COO, and again, just had people that had been there and done it internationally. And so I could just, again, learn like a significant more, add another 10 years of experience to that environment, got given lots of responsibility and to grow that business. And, that business went on to build like the largest loyalty program in the world for McDonald's. And that was just incredible, scale growth curve in that, and then watched them go through how are they going to raise money. They listed on the NZX, and then they had liquidity challenges being on the NZX as a tech company, and then challenges around how do you explain to institutional investors about what you do as a tech company and all of those really interesting things. So got a flavor of those next level challenges. Okay, you have a product, you're making a whole bunch of money, you can get to profitability, but then what are the mechanics that are going to hold you back, or what are the mechanics that change your valuation? So that was really a crash course in the challenges of being in New Zealand tech.
So you helped build this loyalty program?
Yes. Yeah. So I was the CTO of that company that
Wow.
built that product. Yeah.
What anything kind of interesting there? What was that like?
I think the biggest challenge was just scale. In the beginning, you go like, ooh, we should be able to handle 1 million, users. And we're up to 300 million users in like one market. It was just like insane scale. So that journey working with like the Microsoft team, we had the biggest Azure account for New Zealand, which isn't such a big thing, but we had the biggest Azure account like in Japan, and the Japan data center. We would literally have outages because their data center hit capacity, for certain spikes that we had programs going out and things like that. So I think there was that whole learning curve of that ramp up of like, On the one hand, it's like, oh, where do because investment in technology scale matters in terms of how much investment you're going to put in up front. On the one hand, as an early stage company, you never want to overinvest. You don't want to spend $5 million to build the equivalent of what you could have done for $100,000 to test the market. But then at what stage does your product go through these leapfrogs in growth? And then how much tech debt have you got to go and fix, to actually scale up in those environments? So that constant calibration of where is the product getting built for in terms of its scale curve is incredibly challenging, for any of those companies.
Yeah, it's sort of like at every kind of order of magnitude leap, everything breaks, right? Organizationally, tech-wise. And one thing, that I think I've heard a lot of early grad entrepreneurs say is like, if your stuff isn't breaking every month, you're not going fast enough.
Yeah, and it just depends on the industry you're in and how tolerant your customers are and all of those things. And I think most people would agree in most tech companies, that's exactly, a sign of success is like, oh, wow, the fact that you now are facing tech debt because your product is so successful out in the wild, that's fantastic. But it doesn't feel like that when it's happening to you. It feels pretty bad. And then the question is, how long is it going to take to basically catch up and do that type of thing? So I think, some of that. But again, you've got always resource constrained as a software company. 99.9% of the time, you're resource constrained in any company, including overseas. So it's just that allocation. What are you focused on?
Do you feel like that was also kind of happening because you were at a time when the infrastructure was also like expanding and growing? Whereas now, like, I think a lot of infrastructure is very mature, right?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think the early prototype, when I joined the company, the early prototype had been built on SQL Server, and SQL Server is notoriously not going to scale for any kind of consumer system that's going to have hundreds of millions of users instantly, logging into the platform and doing things. That very quickly changed. But then we were going through the evolution of these cloud storage systems. And I think nowadays the default choice for a software team would probably just work and probably just scale. Whereas in those early days, you had to bring specialists in and, look at the different types of storage systems and use various layers. So obviously that's become easier and easier for tech teams to do, but they're facing all sorts of other challenges around AI architectures that are now going to be outdated in a few years' time. So their jobs still continue to be very difficult architecturally, but some of the problems we faced, 10, 15 years ago, those aren't the big problems anymore.
Do you think like whenever you eliminate those challenges, that like the opportunities also diminish greatly? Like, do you feel like, I don't know, are those things correlated?
I mean, it's the question of barrier of entry, and the barrier of entry goes down so that, startup companies, and I think, one of the questions we were talking about a few weeks ago is when will the first $1 billion company come from one person, because the barriers are so low that you just call it a handful of people, just to sound slightly more realistic. It's like, what can a handful of people actually pull off? But I think ultimately the hardest problem still for really good companies is, are you really solving a great customer problem? And is it valuable for that customer to solve that problem? Gone are the days where it was like, oh, does anyone know a technical founder? Because I need someone that knows how to code. You better know how to build software. If you're going to do a software company, you really shouldn't be asking around like that. That should be a known factor. So I think very similar to, you need a quality sales team, good product team, that can build software and scale it, and it needs to be secure. All of those things are just like,
table stakes
criteria. Yeah, table stakes. But yeah, so maybe in some aspects, the threshold, the bar has been lifted on the quality of your product. Like, there's no longer an excuse for it to look ugly. There's tons of amazing designers out there. There's no longer an excuse for it to have a terrible software architecture. It's like there's tons of great software engineers out there. But yeah, so the bar is raised in terms of that competition.
Yeah, and you saw the company going from private to public. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, and what the major differences were? And also, I guess, like nowadays, it's not very common to go public, I guess, that early.
Yeah.
That was a different environment, right?
Yeah, I think, and that was actually a reverse listing, which eventually became popularized as a SPAC. So this is ages ago when, that was kind of in the early days of evolution. And that was really a function of the big investors that had early invested obviously wanted some liquidity, which obviously everyone would love, right? But the problem is, at what point is that viable? And there was a great example with a challenge of liquidity for that company where the actual stock price jumped up like 40% in a day, something crazy like that. And then there was a big investigation, like, why did it jump and all the rest of it. And it just turned out that it was actually just our travel agent at the time decided to invest a couple of grand in the business just to support us, to say, hey, I love you guys. I'm going to put a little bit of money in just to support you. But because there was no liquidity, the next price purchase option was 40% higher. So literally a couple of grand of purchasing like impacted that. And so I think we were just at that stage, we were the wrong type of company to be on the NZX. And we didn't have the right structures and scale for that to be meaningful. There's plenty of tech companies that have done well on the NZX. It didn't work for that business at that stage.
Did that teach you something about markets and liquidity? Because I'm sure everyone was like super rich on paper, but like that means nothing because you can't
Yeah.
actually.
And the problem was too, it was all over the place. And then you're trying to correlate the work that you're doing with, what the stock price is. And I think it was more accentuated than even being on NASDAQ, because at least on NASDAQ, you have a pool of hopefully thousands or tens of thousands of people that are interested versus like one or two, or call it 20. So I think you have all of those challenges to deal with. So
Has that improved over the years? Have you seen that improve in the NZX?
I think you have to be very aware of the type of company you're putting on a market like the NZX, just like you have to be aware of what you're going to stick on the NASDAQ. So I think that, and the question for that company at that stage is, did they have any other options? Maybe the other options were even worse. So I think people are much more aware of it now. Is be careful of the type of company you're going to put on the public market. I think it was a bit of an education. It's even though it was a very small market, there was still a lot of regulatory requirements around, disclosing when big deals had happened and all these kinds of things. We had to be very careful with staff. So all of that was a great education around the public markets. And I would say, yes, it was onerous, but it wasn't too onerous at all, But again, as I say, it was a very small market, but it was completely manageable. That side of things was completely manageable. I just think the value side did it really give liquidity to the investors in a meaningful way? The answer was not really. It was kind of a false, environment from that perspective.
And then, so you left the company to build Rokos next, right? Tell us about how
Yeah.
that happened.
Yeah. And there's kind of a little bit of a backstory happening throughout this time. When I first got to New Zealand in 2000, I met Richard Stenier, who I had hired in that content management company, Rex, and him and I had worked together at that business. He went off to the UK to do an OE, and at VMod Plexure, I called him up, and we were good friends at that stage. And I said, look, I'm looking for a head of engineering. Do you want to come back to New Zealand? It was good timing for him. And he came back with his partner, was worked with me there for a number of years. And at that stage, we were saying, hey, look, what is the next thing? And I think it's that whole stage of a company where it becomes more of an incremental business versus a, scaling business. And yeah, so the question for us is really, was there something we wanted to do together? And I think for me, having him as a business partner historically is we've been through highs, we've been through lows, exactly how each other are going to behave under stressful situations. You have a deep trust because of a 20-year history of having worked together. And yeah, we were looking for a business with certain characteristics, and we have quite complementary skills. He definitely leans into the technology side. I lean into the commercial side. And yeah, I think the premise for Rokos was that over the next 5 or 10 years, we believed that robotics was going to scale. We believed that the universities were outputting quality research, mobility, navigation, gripping, hand gripping. These were all coming to fruition from a lab perspective. But what was missing was the operationalization side, is how would people manage robots from a remote location? There's going to be a whole bunch of robots. They're going to be somewhere else. How do you manage them? So we had this idea that, okay, well, operationalization means people are going to want to connect, monitor, and control robots from remote systems. It's the kind of thing we've been building for mobile apps and these other kinds of ecosystems for a long time. We canvassed the big kind of cloud companies to say, hey, are you doing something with robotics? And they all kind of said, oh, we've got this IoT thing. And we looked at it and said, no, this is not going to work for robots. They're more like mobile servers than a fridge sensor, and spoke to roboticists, and they actually knew nothing about cloud infrastructure. They're roboticists. They know how to code, robots. It's very different to like a mobile app team. A mobile app developer understands cloud. They know how to connect to cloud services. Because roboticists don't. They don't know how to connect to cloud services. And if you get a white paper from AWS on here's how to build IoT infrastructure, it's like completely foreign language. It's like a web developer trying to build a robot. It's just an entirely different, discipline. And so we thought there was a gap there on helping roboticists have something they could just install and just worked, and they could then connect, monitor, and control their robot. And
And why robotics? Like, you're personally curious about it? Well,
I think going back to those criteria you said, and so in that body of research of what are you fascinated by, things like 3D printers were coming out and becoming, consumer grade. You could buy them off the shelf. Drones were becoming, more and more reliable. And so we were specifically looking for a trend. So it was a question of what is something that doesn't exist today that is going to be a thing in 5 or 10 years time that other people are not investing time and energy in. So, and do you have a head start? So, we'd built big secure systems with the big cloud providers. Our specialization wasn't necessarily in the deep research side of things. We weren't going to build the world's next best robot. It was how do you build great cloud infrastructure for this new and emerging industry in a way that makes sense to them. So in terms of that, Venn diagram, could we know enough about robots quickly to actually be very useful as cloud engineers for that industry? And so, that was really our focus, is how do we plug ourselves into the robotic ecosystem without the intention of actually building a robot, but knowing robotics and talking in their language enough so that they go, wow, this is exactly what we need for our industry.
so you basically kind of looked at it as the cross section, the intersection of what am I interested in and like where are things going kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the big risk was the scale of robots. This was late 2017. And, if you said to someone, when last have you looked out your window and saw a robot? It was like, never, So the question was, where were the agricultural robotics? Where were the hospital robotics companies? I think cleaning robots was kind of the earliest signs that was starting to happen. But it was pretty obvious to us that there was a hockey stick going to happen in terms of the scale of robots. And that's happened. It's happened in different verticals potentially than we suspected. Obviously, warehouse robotics, scaled massively. And we were lucky enough to get some very early customers in hospital robotics, things like automating container yards with big autonomous trucks. And they continue on the platform, which is amazing. So,
yeah.
But the scale has definitely been slower than I think we expected in the early days.
And when you spoke about this for the first time with investors, did you ever get the feedback, oh, this is like too early, it's not big enough of a market? What was the sentiment?
Yeah, so the conversation with investors in that stage was really one of, hey, here's our thesis on what's actually going to happen in the robotics space, and here's our credibility in terms of it's very low risk. So it's the mature founder with a strong idea versus a younger founder that hasn't done it before, but maybe a much more mature idea that they've actually proven out. And we kind of fitted into the more mature founder of, we can build software. We've proven that we can sell stuff. We can grow teams. We can hire teams. That's the low risk component. The high risk was what is going to happen in the robotics space. And so, talking to people like Icehouse, they were like, happy to raise off a PowerPoint presentation. It's like, yeah, we agree. We think this is going to happen. We think, and they did some research around robotics and where the scale was going to be. And we spoke to, a number of VCs in Silicon Valley, and that was starting to invest in robotic startups on the robot side of things. And they kind of validated, this is a problem for our teams. They don't have access to these cloud systems and they're going to need them. So it actually wasn't that hard to raise at that stage. I think had it been 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier in New Zealand, it would have been more like the friends and family scenario, which, is more terrifying. You really actually want somebody that does it for a living and knows the risks and is happy to invest with the risks as stated on the piece of paper. And the biggest problem was the total addressable market. Like, well, how many robots are there going to be? I don't know. How many robots are there now? The numbers just weren't published in terms of all these various verticals. So you basically had that premise of, are there going to be enough robots for this to be a thing? And then what is the component that you're solving? And also, if you look at it, this was more like, we always talk about like gold mining. You can either be the person that, is mining the gold, or the person that's selling the picks and shovels. Picks and shovels business is like, there's lots of people mining the gold. Their businesses are actually higher risk. Will this grass cutting robot actually work? Whereas for us, it's like, hey, they might work, they might not work, but then there's going to be a strawberry picking robot that will work, and we'll work with them. So we were spreading our risk, and all the gold miners had to buy picks and shovels, and we were jumping on that bandwagon. So our risk profile wasn't deep tech from that perspective. It was more like tooling. And I think our biggest risk was just, where would the cloud providers go? Where was AWS and Google? Because as soon as they say, look, we've got an off-the-shelf, easy to install robotics plugin, boom, we're out the gate. And actually that just never happened. They still lack, AWS is probably the furthest, but they still lack significant easy to use tooling for robotics.
That was basically the big risk in the business, is like, if one of these big cloud providers goes into this space, we're done. But we're sort of betting that it's too small, and during that time we can grow and dominate the market become really
Yeah.
good, and then it's hard to compete with this.
I think also, call it naive, but we also remained having very strong connections into the big cloud providers and their product teams to say, make sure that if you guys are looking for a platform that is supporting robots, like, we need to be one of the best in the world, and you need to be talking to us from a corp dev perspective. So we also said to our investors, it's like, hey, this could be a short ride. This could be like a 3 or 4 year ride rather than a 10 to 20 year. We'd love it to be the 10 or 20 year because that seems like a hell of a lot of fun. But, if the cloud providers do something, if you're a robotics company choosing between AWS and some random New Zealand company, it's like, even if AWS only has half the features, you're still going to go with AWS. So that was a known threat up front that we were kind of mitigating against.
Looking back, do you think? I mean, obviously, and we can talk about kind of how they like had an exit and how that worked. But like, kind of looking back now, do you think like because a lot of times, I heard the stories where like you sort of somehow walk the precipice in the dark and you somehow just make it, right? And it just works. And it's like you look back and you're like, how did I do that? Like that was so unlikely. Do you think looking back, you explained kind of how you thought about the problem at the time? Looking back, do you think that was all accurate, or do you think there was key pieces that you didn't understand, but like actually you just got lucky around?
I think the part that is still kind of a known dark territory is just, we couldn't fully describe the exact customer profile yet. You couldn't point at like 100 companies and say all 100 of those companies need what we have, and the VC can call all those companies and 99 of them confirm it and they're in. It's more like this industry doesn't exist. Level one has to mature before we're even valuable. So hey, the robot companies need to build robots first, and hey, there's signs of this taking place. Do we all believe that that's true? And then we were a second tier to say, hey, once they start scaling, they're going to need a platform like us. And so the investor really had to believe in that focus. And obviously we were we were believers to say what percentage of that. I think the only question is how many of those companies would build it themselves. So if you looked at like a Tesla building a humanoid robot, they're very unlikely to go to AWS and just get an off-the-shelf system in their entire stack. So the really big high-scale providers potentially would build full stack teams at the end of the day and not need that infrastructure. But the other kind of, we had two kind of bets in the fire. The one was the robotics companies. So what we call robot as a service, you pay on a per robot, per connected basis, almost like an IoT infrastructure play. And then the second one was really corporates to say, hey, you're a big corporate company. So let's say you're a big mining company, and the big mining company is going to land up with a whole bunch of robots, a whole bunch of drones, a whole bunch of ground robots doing inspections, a whole bunch of robots moving dirt around. And would they prefer to have all those robots on a common platform rather than vendor lock-in on every single individual robot? So that was a second bet we had, that these enterprises would need control surfaces to generically tell robots what to do, and we can swap out the robot. So if you're an airport and you have a cleaning robot, you map your floor, you set up your cleaning schedule. You don't necessarily want to have to throw that all away if you want to choose another cleaning robot. Maybe we're the surface where you define all that work for robots, multiple form factors in your airport or in your hospital, and you can then negotiate with the vendor to say, look, our platform works, we could use you or somewhere else. Let's talk about price, and they don't have that vendor lock-in. And that is in fact why we got acquired, was really that corporate side of things as a control surface for multiple robot form factors, but mostly for enterprises to actually control those robots and automate very specific tasks.
So that was the use case that got traction then, the corporate or the enterprise use case?
Well, we had traction on both sides, and we were still very early days. And we were doing a partnership with DroneDeploy at that stage, evaluating oil and gas, use cases. And DroneDeploy had done a lot of work around automating a pilot with the drone at the site already. So the flight path of the drone, where it flies, when it takes photos. So they already had a deep appreciation of the complexity of supporting a device, but their technology required a human to be connected with an app right by rather than where the evolution was going to be. There's no humans there, just robots, drones and docks, ground robots, Boston Dynamics robots walking around. So what is that connectivity software for actually automating that reality capture process of what they do? And so that's really where the acquisition hit, is that they understood the complexity of the stuff that we had done and had a deep appreciation. We were only 4 years in. We'd already done some work with them over the course of 6 to 12 months. And we're like, yeah, we think this is going to be an important part of, our suite of products that we offer customers for reality capture. I think the other interesting thing of why it happened early was DroneDeploy's use case was incredibly simple. They didn't need robots that could have hands or arms, which are still struggling to get traction just because it turns out it's incredibly complex and you need a very high level of trust to let a robot do anything physically. And so all they needed was, could you wake the robot up, get it to a set of locations, take a whole bunch of sensor data like photos and make it home alive. Turns out that's still incredibly difficult. Like the bar is still very high to do that, but it's the simplest possible thing with what you can do with robots that are at a certain level of maturity. So instead of waiting for all of these other much more advanced robots to become cost effective and reliable, there was a suite of robots we could immediately start operating with for a commercial model that companies could use.
And for that use case of like, wake a robot up, have it go to the sensor, take photos. Why can't those folks just install cameras or install sensors that communicate with the internet at those locations? Like, why put a robot there? It seems like over engineering.
Yeah, so I'll strengthen that argument in one use case. So there was probably, call it 2021, there was a whole bunch of robots that were starting to be designed to operate in supermarkets that would do shelf scanning. They'd go up and down, and then they realized that children were scared of the robot going up and down, so they put friendly faces on it and designed all these techniques to make these robots, useful. And then somebody said, well, why don't you just put cameras on the opposite shelf and stare at the shelf instead of having all these robots terrifying children and breaking down and requiring robotics experts? That whole industry just vanished overnight by putting up cameras. But the infrastructure was already there. In a shelf is power and internet connectivity. It's a very contained environment. And so the level of quality you need from the cameras is incredibly low. So you can get $20 cameras, not $20,000 cameras. So that industry that turned out to be true, it's like, hey, just stick some cameras in there and we're done. The industries where that's not true is, especially if you take oil and gas and mining, incredibly harsh environments. The number of cameras you'd need and the quality you'd need, some of these cameras cost $100,000. So you can't just stick up 200 of them in a row staring at stuff. Plus, in many cases, it's too late to actually add significant infrastructure into a 20-year-old, 40-year-old infrastructure. So very expensive camera. You want routine sweeps, and there's lots and lots of things you want to capture. There's the gauge, there's the pipe, then you've got to crawl under here and look over there, and then you're looking for a puddle on the floor. So the only way to get full coverage with very expensive sensors is to carry the sensors around. And even in many cases, the humans can't even carry the sensors around. It's just impractical. Never mind those harsh environments. There's higher requirements in health and safety. They want to get rid of the people. They don't want to fly the people into those remote requirements, all the carbon footprint of doing that and the cost. So a lot of those, they really want full automation, and robots make a lot of sense for those types of use cases.
Got it. And so what kinds of I guess like use case? So you mentioned oil and gas, like, and these folks would already have robot. Like, how did it sort of begin? Like your product discovery, you're building the product. Like, so you had this like general idea, like this is a problem, but like, did you then go to the robotics companies and say, hey, like we're going to help you manage these fleets, or did you go to the companies and say, you have these robots already, we're going to help you manage them? Like, who's the customer? How'd you figure that out?
Yeah, and so because we were working on both sides of the fence, I mean, our ideal situation was to find a robotics company that had product market fit and was starting to scale. That would have been perfect. But what you actually had was a whole bunch of early stage robotics companies desperately trying to get product market fit and trying to get their robot to actually work reliably in that environment. And there were only a few use cases that had already proven to be successful. DJI building, an $800 drone that just worked was like the earliest signs that, hey, this will happen, but it's going to take time to actually take place. So, and then we were talking to the enterprise customers around what are the problems they have that could possibly be solved with robots. And what we found was the robotics companies often were very bad at talking to the right corporates about their robot because they're a bunch of roboticists and they know nothing about the world yet. They've just, they're PhD students and they spent, 7 years building this amazing robot. And, so they struggle to work. Not all of them, some of them were, industry specific, but a lot of them just struggle. And then on the enterprise side, often they make terrible buying decisions. So then they say, oh, well, how hard could it possibly be? We'll just download some open source stuff and buy a $500 chassis and get it working. It's like, no, that's also not going to work. So we actually landed up being in that consulting chair of, hey, we've talked to these robotics companies. We've already kind of qualified their robot. It works. Like, it's great. And we know what your problem is. And we know that their robot will work on your site. So we actually got to the point with enterprises where they said, look, if they said, we've already bought a robot, could you use it? We became quite picky. Eventually we'd be like, no, we can't use the robot. Sorry, you chose the wrong one. But if you choose these guys, we can help you. yes, our software will work, but that robot's not going to work. And unless that robot solves their problem, both of us look bad, the robot company and us. So very quickly, we got into the position where we had to become quite picky about which robot was going to be applied in the environment. And that built very strong relationships. The Boston Dynamics is, top 3 partners. We had the first spots come into New Zealand. It was literally as lockdown was taking place in COVID. We were stuck at home, myself and Richard with a spot sitting next to us, coding away. I was actually out in an avocado orchard with the Boston Dynamics engineering team, with their first teleoperation of Spot was happening like on this avocado orchard to New
And
Zealand.
Spot was as Spot as like the dog?
Yeah, the yellow dog from Boston Dynamics. Yeah. So that was kind of a big breakthrough industry wise, because suddenly you had a whole bunch of enterprise corporates going, wow, this thing is amazing. And it had wide enough coverage that some corporates started to buy these things, even though they were, more than $100,000. Corporates started to buy them, oil and gas companies, mining companies, to say, hey, our R&D lab wants to have a crack at this. Let's see if we can get it running. And that was a great early days for us to go in with those organizations. And, we built a very strong integration with that robot. And, a lot of our big corporates now at DroneDeploy use this robot form factor specifically for their use cases.
That's the one, right?
Yeah.
Any videos of that, Henrik?
I can check. We can put it in later.
You actually look up Spot Sheep New Zealand, sheep herding New Zealand. We had this during COVID. We took, was on a farm, and we basically took some video footage of Spot chasing a whole bunch of sheep around, and we woke up to millions of views and a whole bunch of news channels wanting to interview us, and very angry shepherds wondering why we were replacing all their sheepdogs with Spot. And I assured them that it was just a stunt. Yeah, and a lot of those, The Guardian and CNN and a bunch of them actually reused the footage.
So
I think that's the interview.
Dave, did you guys do this as a stunt, or were you thinking, can you make it full screen? Were you thinking you'd actually use this as a use case?
No, I think we were interested in robotics in agriculture. And so we thought, we literally had these robots in these environments. And so we thought it would be interesting to kind of demonstrate what could a robot do in these kind of agricultural environments. If it was going to land up being a Spot dog robot, who knows? And, I think scanning kiwi fruit has always been a thing for, Robotics Plus that literally got bought a few days ago. That was a great example, and they're actually just around the corner from me here. So we always believed that was a use case. Would a robot be chasing sheep around? No, I don't think we ever.
So Rokos, that's your company name, right?
Yeah. So this is Richard being interviewed, my business partner.
So they're your co-founder. Richard is your co-founder? Okay.
That's super exciting.
So that was super fun. One of those great business stories.
Sorry, which company did you say just got acquired?
Robotics Plus.
So what do they do?
They started off doing agricultural robot that was going to be doing kiwi fruit picking, and they branched out to apple packing robots, and they did a lot of work with Yamaha around building a multi-form factor agricultural robot. So it's kind of like an autonomous tractor, which you can put spraying equipment on and a bunch of other things.
Wow. Yeah, I'm seeing it now. That's cool.
And so going back to the acquisition, so DroneDeploy was first a customer partner, and then what happened? How did this conversation happen that suddenly you thought it would be worth joining them?
Yeah. It's one of those things where when you start looking at a partnership like that, the deeper the partnership gets, the more complicated your business relationship gets. The fear of, you're putting a lot of energy into building things that are specifically going to work with this company and their customers. If that relationship ever ends, then are you exposed? Because now you've heavily saturated your revenue to that customer, and you've heavily skewed your features to that customer. And similarly, the risk for DroneDeploy is, if something happens to us, like we get bought by someone else or we die, and then what happens to them? So I think at the back of your mind, when you're doing that kind of deeper and deeper partnership, you're always wondering, like, is there actually a better path forward? And because we were still early days, we weren't looking for an acquirer. I think we were always making sure we were covered from a cloud perspective, but we had never considered something like the DroneDeploy type of company. But we loved the team. They had very similar values in their team. We'd worked with them for a period of time. We loved their use case. We thought their use case was excellent in terms of where the robot maturity was at that point. And literally on a call, the CEO just said to me, have you guys thought of being acquired? And so, and that accelerated. We were raising money at that stage. And I just said, look, if we're going to do this, we have to do it like immediately. Or hey, we just keep partnering. That's great. We're going to complete our capital raise. And because I think we had that kind of compelling deadline, it was convenient to DroneDeploy at the time. Yeah, we found a deal that worked. And I think for my co-founder and I, and many of our shareholders still own a lot of stock in DroneDeploy. And we were looking at it as a, hey, it's still early days. Option A, we keep going at it ourselves, so down path A, and what is the risk reward profile there? Option B, we join a company that has incredible VCs out of Silicon Valley. They're incredibly well funded. They've got probably 80 out of 100 customers we want. So, we just get access to all of these customers. Plus there's upside in terms of we take a lot of shareholding in their business and how much could we scale their business in terms of revenue and things like that. And I mean, the great thing is DroneDeploy has, grown its revenue year on year significantly since we joined them. Some of it was us, but a lot of it's just the other things that they were doing. So yeah, so looking back,
I mean,
we've loved the partnership.
Sounds like an easy decision in hindsight, but how did you make up your mind? Did you lose sleep over it? How tough was that decision?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, obviously it's not just you at that stage. You've got shareholders. So it's a question K1W1, Icehouse is probably the biggest shareholder. And, it's a question of how do they feel about that risk reward profile? And in the early days, they were like, oh, this is great. We'll love to take the cash. And then the more they looked at DroneDeploy, the more they were like, man, we'd love to take the shares. This is amazing. Let's do that. So that was an interesting navigation. So I think, but firstly, I think the New Zealand ecosystem and for K1W1 and iSouth, both of them are very founder focused. Firstly, they know that whatever the founders want to do, you basically have to talk the founders out of it, if they don't want to do it because, and they were very supportive. They were like, look, let's lay it out. What does the opportunity look like? What is the scale potential here with this business? And then the complication around, moving the entity, basically getting acquired by a US entity was a consideration. Yeah. Looking back, the biggest complication was really just, unpicking the fact that we were, looking to raise money at the time. But the good news is we had all of our finances ready to go and investor packs. And it was like, well, yeah, here's everything. We don't have to do any additional work for you to have a look at our business and go forward.
Looking back, I mean, do you think you could have gone as far as big, just building Rokos?
I think the question is what would our brand look like right now? And over the last 3 or 4 years, when AI has kind of hit, companies like ours have lent into, basically what is the physical, how do you, adopt AI in the physical world, embodied AI. And I think we would have lent into the embodied AI track. So I think we would have started off in cloud infrastructure for robots, which is probably appropriate for, 2017 to 2020, 21. And then I think we would have continued to lean into skill sets for robots and landed up down that path. But, interestingly enough, it was actually the peak of the market when we got acquired, and the next, 3 years did not look good. And I remember Richard and I saying like, wow, imagine if we were trying to raise money now, and so, yeah, so the question is, what would have happened in those years? So you never know. I think the main thing is, I think as entrepreneurs, you also just very rarely regret anything. It's just you made the decision, you had as much information as you had at the time, and you're always making the best. You want to make the choice for yourself. You never want the choice made for you. So make the choice yourself with the information you have, and then just double down on the choice you've made,
And this was during COVID. So did the whole acquisition happen remotely?
Yes. The whole acquisition was super weird.
Wow.
We had met one of the co-founders of DroneDeploy in San Francisco at the introduction of Airtree a few years prior. So we were lucky enough to have seen their office, met one of the co-founders, and Jono, one of the co-founders, is actually one of the, I'd call him like the executive sponsor of the deal. He was like, hey, I know these guys. I've met them. I've been watching and tracking them. I've been doing this partnership with them. But none of the other team had that exposure. As soon as flights got opened up to New Zealand, they were like, right, get everyone on the plane. So we all traveled over, had a great kickoff. Everyone got COVID, and we were all stuck in the US with COVID.
Damn.
Because none of us had COVID, and plenty of people in the US had.
What an introduction. And what is DroneDeploy?
So they specialize in what's called reality capture. So if you take a construction company, they always continuously want to know the current exact state of progress. And if you can build a digital version of the physical site, it means people can log into the digital version and actually verify exactly what progress has actually taken place. So they started off by just having aerial maps. So you fly a drone once a week and you could see progress from the air. And another acquisition they did, they can now do cameras walking around with humans, with robots or humans, and scan the inside of these buildings building. So they're effectively building a digital twin of physical infrastructure so that then you can have humans collaborate on that digital version of the physical infrastructure. But increasingly now you can actually get digital workers, as in AI, can do things on that digitized version. So because you've digitized their physical environment, you can actually do intelligence work now on that digital environment. So
what kind of work could you do?
So like safety is a great example. Because we have a digital copy of the site, we can actually scan through with AI and look for safety hazards, and we can classify them against, American OSHA standards. Something that would have taken a safety officer literally having to drive to the location, which is not necessarily an hour away. It could be 5 hours away, walk the entire site, take their camera, photograph stuff, document hazards. Oh, there's a slip and trip over there and there's a barrier missing there. All of that's now done, digitized in the platform. So you've got this base now. So instead of the humans coming into the digital version and remotely doing it so they don't have to drive to site, you now have the ability to actually apply these techniques. And progress is something that the industry has also been working on, is can you quantify what has been added or changed at the construction site over the last week, and can you document it accurately and check it according to plan? And those are the kinds of things now that's kind of the holy grail of that industry. But we also do industrial inspection off to Houston on Sunday, and we do a lot of work with the oil and gas and mining companies around understanding the state of their physical infrastructure. So if you can digitize it, not just with like RGB cameras, but with gas measurement and thermal imagery, and you can quantify exactly the state of their physical infrastructure, and they can share that, and they can across their entire organization without actually visiting the site. So, and that's really why the drones and the ground robots and the automation is so essential. It's just you're trying to continuously just update this digital twin of your physical infrastructure.
And Rokos was instrumental because they wanted to keep it all. So basically, Rokos kind of does eval or hosting, or what's like the right kind of like software analogy?
The Rocos, so DroneDeploy really has kind of a three-legged stool approach. The focus is really on, you really want to have this digital copy. But the one thing that the industry didn't have was they didn't have both aerial and internal. There was usually two different pieces of software. So they bought a company called Struction Site, and one of the focuses was on a concept called Unify. So now you have one digital product which has the outside and the inside of the thing that you're interested in. And that seems very obvious in hindsight, but most of our competitors actually still have separate systems for aerial and ground. So DroneDeploy is one of the first to unify that, and that was through that. The second area is really the concept of automate, and automate was us. So it was that ability to, how do you update that digital copy of your physical environment on a continuous basis without having a roster of humans carrying sensors around? So things like dock drones, and that's all built out of our New Zealand, Auckland office, where there's literally a dock. A drone lives inside, the dock opens up, the drone flies, comes back, dock closes, uploads all the data, and you get a digital copy of your site, and you can just schedule that to happen. There's all sorts of airspace stuff that has to happen in between, but that's now completely viable and scaling quite rapidly. And then the other one is what we call ground robotics, which is something like a Boston Dynamics Spot robot. Lives on a charge base, and there's a number of other robots, and they wake up and they roam around and take photos and come back home and upload all the data again. So that was really the Rokos technology, with how do you automate the capture of all of that technology. And then the third kind of area is intelligence, is now that you've got both the outside and the inside, and you can automate a continuous update of that digital system. Now, what kind of intelligence layers can you add on to that? Can you read gauges? Can you tell if the oil's running out? Can you tell if there's a leak? Can you tell if there's a crack? Can you, and so you just get this virtuous cycle of, the status of your infrastructure. You can sleep at night. If you're worried, you can log in and go and zoom in. You can annotate and share the issue with somebody really easily. It's just replacing very manual digitization processes that these companies used to have.
And to me, it feels like that is part of the core. Like if you're building a robotics company that does this, it feels like that automation and the gathering of the data, that feels like a core competency, right? Like, why wasn't that? Or did they build that and they just yours was better? Or like, why was not something that they built from the ground up and had as a function internally?
Yeah, the robotics companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the robotics companies were all desperately trying to get product market fit. They didn't know either what the product was going to be. And if you take Boston Dynamics' journey, how much they invested in wild areas, like robots literally in cornfields, trying to stumble through the mud, all sorts of crazy scenarios. They have eventually landed on a very specific use case, which is not even kind of heavy oil and gas. They've actually landed up in like factory environments. So if you're producing Coke cans, there's a robot monitoring that environment. So I think those types of things but also then if you look at adding us to DroneDeploy now has 10 years on them in terms of digitizing physical environments. So they don't have, for example, something called a photogrammetry engine, which can take a whole bunch of photos and convert it into a 3D model. So for them to build that will be $100 million worth of engineering, whereas we already have that. So it's the combination of us automating the robot with the digitization process that gives us a big edge. What we did find at Rokos was over time, we started to compete with people like Boston Dynamics' own systems, because in the early days, they just wanted their robot to work. We would have far superior technology to them in terms of getting their robot to automate. So they'd bring us into deals. We'd help their customers actually automate the robot. But over time, they wanted, as you said, that full stack. But the only time they could build the full stack is once they figured out what their robot was going to specialize in.
So is the right way to sort of think about this, like, is basically to imagine, like, there's no cars in the world, and then all of a sudden people start building cars, but in parallel, you guys are building like the FSD or the full self-driving software like Tesla has that like allows you to like gather all the sensor data and actually allow the car to like self-drive, like on
Yeah.
is that sort of like the right analogy?
Yeah, one analogy. So there was kind of two critical milestones of things that we would provide. The first one would just be raw connectivity. It was like, is there a cloud platform that you can connect vehicles to so you can monitor vehicles? CAN bus connection, you install this on the car and now you can monitor your fleet. That was kind of a ground zero. You can turn on the video on the vehicles, on the trucks and see where the truck's driving, and that infrastructure play is it just works. You buy it off the shelf, from a fleet management. The second one is what we call our mission stack. So it's the ability to define a very complicated mission. A drone's mission is very simple. Go to this height, fly to this GPS coordinate, point your camera, take a photo. That's 90% of what a mission looks like. Ground robots are incredibly difficult. Where am I waking up? What map am I using? When was the map updated last? What if there's a barrier? Do I go home? Do I try again? Do I sit down? If the gas reading gets above a certain level, evacuate. There's just lots of like logic that needs to go into each of these missions. So that mission stack, and that's closer to like an electric car company saying, look, we're not going to build self-driving ourselves. We're going to license it from Neuro. So hey, Neuro, tell us what sensors to put on the robot and what software we need. And now suddenly our electric car is off. And obviously some companies will build their own and then some companies will license other people's. Yeah. So that is a possible analogy.
Makes sense. Interesting. So right now, it sounds like these algorithms that you're telling the robots to do, these sequences of events and schedules they need to execute with the contingencies, that sounds still like fairly basic in the sense that like it's still like a decision tree and then like there's you don't have AI in there yet, in the sense that like the robot's sort of making its own decisions. And
yeah, so I think what we'd say about AI mostly exists on the robot. Most of these robots are being trained in cloud physics simulators nowadays. So the leg used to be programmed, and the robots that had a 30-year-old algorithm for the leg to move actually just have eventually now gone away. All these robots are now fully trained. So the actual robot itself is continuously using what people loosely could call AI to move around, know where
the mechanics of it, right?
Yeah, and actually move itself correctly in that environment. A lot of what we do is just infrastructure. It's SOC 2 compliant telemetry off of any robot form factor with an agent that's very low power sitting on the robot with a logic engine that is resilient to internet connectivity outages. So it's very much in that, as I say, operationalization layer. It's just a whole bunch of engineering stuff where a whole bunch of engineering decisions and people have built something that now works. It's like buying table storage off a cloud provider. It's like somebody had to build that thing that you can consume it.
That makes sense. Yeah. So from where you're sitting, you probably have a good sense of when we're going to get kind of reasoning, like robots that can reason. I mean, like, do you already see that? Or like, when do you think that'll happen? Where like you have a robot that sort of just give it a vague task, right? In the same way that you give an LLM like a vague task, and then sort of just like goes and reasons and then outputs, like does some series of actions. And
I think because we don't specialize in that area, and because we have seen so much hype around what robots could potentially do over the last 10 years and what they really can't do, like even at the moment, the reliability on a robot waking up, getting the photo and making its way home alive is still really low. And it's like, come on, you're seeing all these videos of these amazing robots doing these amazing things. And it's like, hey, just to build base reliability into basic logic is still very, very hard. And then people say, well, hey, when is this robot going to reason. So I say like, so just like ground robots have like exponentially more complicated than aerial robots. Aerial robots generally always have GPS coordinates. It's very easy to get a robot to go from point A to point B in the sky. Is, exponentially more complicated indoors when you don't have GPS for a robot to know where it is and to get from point A to point B. Plus things can get in its way. There's people moving around. It's like significantly more complicated. And then you start adding in something like, when is a robot going to be able to fold the laundry? So even without the reasoning part of, hey, go find the laundry in the house and just like fold it, it may land up on the couch folding a blanket or something stupid. Like even knowing the context of laundry basket, it's clean laundry, not dirty laundry. It's just like this massive problem. It's like really, really complicated. So I think that is the holy grail. And I think that's where the embodied AI is really focusing on, to say like, yeah, we can actually make a robot that, because it looks like a human and people look at it moving and they freak out and they go, this thing is now a human. It's like, no, it's like 0.1% of a human right now. What's more of a human is ChatGPT. That's way more of a human. This robot is like not a human. It's super dumb. So yes, as I say, even finding the clean laundry is going to be a mammoth task. Never mind picking it apart and putting it down and folding it, and then knowing where each piece goes intuitively and opening drawers without them falling out, or, what if there's not enough space in the drawer? That is going to take a long time to solve. And so the question with any of these robots is, a lot of these humanoid robotics companies learned from Boston Dynamics, who started off really generic, saying, we're a cool tech company, we can build robots, and then we'll figure out what they're good at. A lot of the humanoid robotics companies are saying, look, let's absolutely focus on a use case that's simpler. It's really simple. Health and safety environment, like a factory context for building a BMW. You can put up perimeter tape. We're not going to hurt anyone. Tech, we don't have kids getting hurt by robots folding laundry. And then it's like a highly contained use case. Like we can pre-train it on every object it's ever going to come interaction with. There's only 3 types of panels, car panels, you're ever going to touch. Here they are, pre-programmed, ready to go. You're only ever going to stand like in 2 places, there and there. We can map the environment. So they've constrained the domains of problem right down and get those working, and then they can build layer on layer on layer. So even when these robots start coming into the home, they're going to start off with incredibly basic tasks. And I think we had a chat in the car around even cooking, like even the best cooking robots, at best can make one type of pizza, or at best can make soup. That's like the extent of their capability. So I think, is AI going to provide these incredible leapfrogs where year on year we're going to make massive progress? Man, I hope so. But history says no. History with autonomous driving says it's going to take way longer than we think to get a sock folding robot that can put the socks away in the drawer. That's
And what do you think will be the first kind of mass, application of kind of robotics in a consumer setting, like in a home, for example, or in a workplace?
The big question is still the specialized robot. It's like, oh, well, I could use that robot to vacuum my floor. It's like, well, just get a vacuum cleaner robot. It's way cheaper and much more reliable. So, well, maybe it could wash my dishes. Like you already have a dishwasher, but it needs to be packed. So I think eventually you realize, well, outdoors, you're probably going to get a lawn mowing robot. You're not going to use the humanoid there. Indoors, you already have a washing machine and a dishwasher and certain things. And then if somebody said laundry folding, maybe it's just a laundry folding cabinet, which they have now, which, they're working on. And all that thing does is fold laundry, out comes from the dryer, goes in that thing. So I think it is a fascinating thing. And I think the problem is the robot's going to have to be incredibly generic to actually be useful for those kinds of environments. And you might find specific robot form factors just outperform it for a while until it becomes really, really good. And it can pack the dishwasher, maybe cook, and I'm in, like when it can start doing that stuff, all of us are going to buy one, but
It won't be like a Judy from the Jetsons, but it'll be more like, I talk to like my ChatGPT or my Siri on my phone, and there's like 10 specialized robots in my house, each doing a certain thing. Kind of thing?
I think it's going to be all of those. I think we will continue to see specialized robots getting cheaper and better at mowing your lawn rather than teaching a humanoid robot to drag your lawnmower around. But then also I think there's just a level of tasks which require high mobility and height, which is designed for a human. So to get dirty plates off the table, take them to the kitchen, rinse them off, stick them in the dishwasher, pretty hard to build a robot that can do that. That doesn't look like a human. That's designed for a humanoid robots. But I think we are going to see a number of those things shrink. So, by the time they're ready, like some of their tasks already would be done by a specialist robot that's going to continue to be just better than them. maybe
I mean,
laundry, folding,
my sense is like I feel like, and I don't know if this directly answers that question that I asked, but it feels like military use case might be the first time where we see like at real scale like autonomous robots, right? Like you're seeing it in Ukraine now with the drones, and a lot of the drones are becoming more and more autonomous. And we looked at a couple of companies that are doing that, basically just killer drones, right? Like
and again, it's highly contained. I think one of the problems is people always associate robots with batteries, not petrol. And if you look at Robotics Plus, it's like, hey, if you're trying to last in a farm for a long period of time, maybe using diesel is the way to go. Maybe it's a gen set that powers a battery, but it's, hey. So I think the question is, what is, is it then an autonomous vehicle, not a robot? I think the biggest problem, a lot of people, like just that use case of using a spot robot to chase sheep around, it's like, if you look at these farm dogs, they'll operate for 10 hours nonstop. This robot will last half an hour out in the field, and it's going to sit in the first puddle, and then its battery's fried, and it can't jump fences. So you have to keep opening fences for the stupid robots. So imagine trying to take a robot like that into warfare. It's like, it can hardly carry anything. It's only going to last a couple of hours. What are you going to carry a whole bunch of gen sets around to like charge your robot fleet? It's like, it's okay with a drone. It can last 3 hours. It can get to its target, job done, but some of these other robots is like, there's real power problems. There's real practical application problems. And so you'll find, hey, maybe a dog robot. We work with a great company in the oil and gas industry called Ghost Robotics. They build a version for the military, which does perimeter security. So if you're on a base, robot wakes up, walks the perimeter, makes sure nobody's trying to climb in, goes back and charges up and keeps going. Yeah, great use case. Those robots are ready for that. I think it's just
so it sounds like
where
battery
yeah,
technology is still a limitation for a lot of these use cases.
yeah, definitely. So that one is fantastic, and that gets you about 2.5, 3 hours, which would be considered like military grade. Like that's really amazing. Yeah.
What do you think about China? I mean, I've seen a lot of these videos now, like crazy robots, like Boston Dynamic types that do backflips and run around and like go up mountains and like all this kind of stuff. Very impressive demos, obviously, but like,
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like China's almost at the forefront. Is that true?
I think so. If you look at the concentration of where the VCs are, if you took software in general, you'd go, Silicon Valley. There's a lot of SaaS companies coming out of that area, a decade ago. If you look at robotics, it's really not the case. The robotics companies are concentrated mostly around really good universities. Boston, MIT, Zurich, these types of areas. And China definitely has a massive concentration of incredible robotics companies. They have a history of things like DJI, where people underestimated DJI, saying, we think, maybe they're just copying other people's technology faster because they've got better production facility. And eventually it's like, no, actually this drone is twice as good as everyone else's and half the price. It's like suddenly they just dominate the market. So there's always the threat in that kind of manufacturing that those iteration cycles can be incredibly tight when you have manufacturing, innovation, product design right next to each other, which happens in very few other places in the world than China. And so you're constantly you're iterating every 6 months in your version of your robot instead of taking 2 years to iterate in your robot. And the impact of that is you eventually just get faster than the competitors. But there is constantly, especially the areas we work in, there are requirements around which robots can and can't be used in some of these facilities. So that is a limiting factor. When it comes to consumer robots, I mean, electric vehicles, BYD is doing an amazing job, and they've got way ahead of the competition. So the only question with humanoid robots is because of their physical form factor, it is going to freak people out. And then you're going to have a very deep, trusting relationship with the person behind the technology of that humanoid robot. And this is where people like Apple may have one of the only brands in the world that'll actually, where people will go, oh yeah, I'm comfortable for Apple to have a robot in my home that could record all the time because I've had them in my pocket the whole time and I've kind of hoped they're not recording. So I think for certain form factors, there are national security interests at heart. You might even find with consumer robots in the US, they have similar national security type challenges as Huawei and networking and all of those types of things. It's like, imagine having a robot in everyone's house in America where, it comes from a country you don't feel comfortable with.
Do you think that's the next big platform? Do you feel like, because I've heard rumors that both Apple and Google, I mean, Apple scrapped the car. I think that was focusing that team on like at-home robot, and Google as well. Amazon has released some kind of prototype at-home robot. Do you feel like that is the next kind of big play and platform for a lot of these big tech companies? Is that How do you think about that?
I think my answer is yes. The question is it 5 years away or 30 years away? So I think that the time horizon just might be so much further than those companies are. Not that they've all done research into it, but is it the right time to do that? The other question is some of those players are actually, look, we don't actually want to be the hardware company because it's like being a laptop company. It's a race to the bottom. We don't want to be the laptop company. We want to be the operating system. If you're the operating system with an app ecosystem, that's where the money's at. Apple will say, look, we want to own the whole end-to-end experience, but Google might be, look, if those things are running Android and we can sell apps on the humanoid robots, that's all we want. We don't want to be building hardware unless we absolutely have to. So I think that'll be an interesting evolution that takes place. But if you look at self-driving, it's like you really have to be BYD or Tesla to be able to own the interface and own that relationship with the customer. They're not just going to install Android necessarily exclusively as the operating system. So I'm personally fascinated that humanoid robots may replace a lot of these other form factors like quadrupeds that currently exist because of the scale and investment going into them. I think who owns the operating system is going to be fascinating. And I'm still fascinated, like, will there be an app ecosystem or a skills ecosystem for humanoid robots? Like, will you pay an extra $5 for it to be able to make great lasagna? It's like, sure, take my money.
I was talking to somebody and like he was saying that there have to be an app ecosystem because for a lot of these things, an Apple or Google wouldn't want to endorse a certain action, right? If you have like like a robot in your house, Apple doesn't, like, who knows what that action could do? That action could kill somebody, right?
Yeah.
And so like you outsource that risk.
The terms and conditions of that action when you buy the app or the skill. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's an interesting one.
But so you think that's more like 20 years away than 5 years away?
I don't know. It's that whole event horizon where what is the current state of AI going to actually accelerate? And it has happened in the last 3 years that the mobility for robots have suddenly swapped from you need that MIT person that worked at Boston Dynamics for 30 years to get your robot to move smoothly to Disney, who produced their own robot from scratch in 12 months. And this thing is incredible. Like out the box, just amazing.
Disney has a robot?
Yeah, so Disney has a little Star Wars robot. If you Google that one, that is going to be roaming around the Disneyland in LA, their Star Wars set. That robot is actually blind. It uses feeling and mobility. The whole thing was trained in the cloud on the NVIDIA stack. It's phenomenal. So that went from, it used to take you $10 million to build a mobile robot that worked really well to like, you can do it for $100,000 now. So the question is for this next level of, but again, if you look at the hands that these robots are focused on,
it's so complicated.
People have been really working hard on those for the last decade. Are they suddenly going to accelerate? Maybe, maybe not. Yeah. It's an event horizon that people are investing in, but yeah, we don't know how long that's going to take.
Wow.
And they actually had animators that put in certain like cute animation features that were then put into this, AI model as part of the training and reinforcement process to not only get these things to walk, but to get them to walk in a cute way or get them to make cute movements.
Wait, so you're saying they're blind?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is that? For privacy purposes?
It's just simpler. So they're not autonomous. So you actually need a remote control to maneuver them. So all the AI is really around balance and mobility and leg movements and where the head goes.
Oh, I see.
But it looks like there's cameras, but they don't need cameras because the operators are basically just going to press forward and the robot's going to move forward. But the robot doesn't know what it looks like in front of them. They're not trying to predict height of ground or anything. It's literally machine feedback. So as soon as it hits the ground, it knows where it is. And they show these things walking over boulders and little balancing beams and just incredible. And it's all trained in the cloud. So they take their model, stick it in the cloud, run it through training simulations, load it up.
Wow. So you're already basically saying that like whatever would have taken you, like a couple of years, maybe 3 years with the top experts is now commoditized.
Maybe a decade.
A decade.
If you think how long it took Boston Dynamics to get to Spot, it was 30 years.
Yeah.
And now the motors, the actuators, the force feedback systems, the cloud training, it's like, 12 months, you can build a half-decent robot.
Wow. So it does feel like things are speeding up.
Yeah. But again, same with autonomous vehicles. We were 90% of the way there like 10 years ago. It's like, once you're 90% of the way there, it takes you just as long to get to another 9, and then it takes you just as long to get to another 9. So when you talk about autonomous vehicles, how many 9s do you need to sit in the back seat and not die? And then if you look at humanoid robots, like how many 9s do you need so that your kid doesn't get hurt in the house by the robot? It's like quite a few 9s,
Yeah.
So you just have this goal that even though you can get it to perfectly work in the lab and everyone celebrates, you're probably only at 90%. And then you stick it in the first few households and you realize, oh, we thought we were at 99, but actually we're only at 90. And then, and it just continues to be very, very
Have
challenging.
you taken a Waymo in SF?
Yes. Yeah, totally.
So what do you think?
I think, well, firstly, it's exciting. And I mean, I had driven in autonomous vehicles 5-6 years ago, which was probably more freaky because they were lab testing at that stage. But with the Waymo, I think the most surprising thing was it's obviously incredibly impressive and the user experience is amazing for the first 5 minutes. I think the most amazing thing is after 5 minutes, you totally don't care anymore and you just forget about it and you're talking to your colleagues that you're in the car with. And then from then on, that's the only thing you want to order because it just works and it's easy and it's quick. So I think it's how normalized it becomes. It's like when you walk in your friend's house for the first time and they have a humanoid robot, for the first few years, everyone's going to be freaked out and it's going to be, this constant conversation. Then at some point, it's just, when is it normalized? When is it just like, oh, we've had Charlie the robot in the house for the last 2 days and like the kids don't even care. Now they're starting to get Charlie to do things.
Yeah. Did you ever read any of those Isaac Asimov like I, Robot books?
Yeah.
Because I think he addressed a lot of these questions, like every aspect of robotics and like different kind of like moral conundrums we'd get into. And he had like robots raising kids and some kids were just never actually talk to people. Like it was like in one of the books, it was very strange to meet people in person.
Yeah. And you have to tell your robot not to let the kids boss it around. It's like, no, I can tell you to clean the dishes, but the kids can't.
Yeah.
Kids clean up their own dishes. Yeah. I think for me though, it's a challenge because I think for me, those problems are so far away. The ability to even just identify the sock to pick up is hard. Never mind how to fold it or figure out if it's clean or not. It's just, so I think at the moment it's very much that research phase. And then eventually if you get to the problem, like the autonomous driving companies had to choose under what circumstances do you swerve and hurt that person versus the passenger versus those various, and they have to make those choices at some point. But that's a privilege to make those kind of choices. You really have to have a functioning working system to be privileged to make those choices.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Well,
cool. David, sorry, Mark.
No, I was going to say any kind of like thoughts and advice for people building in New Zealand? I mean, especially, you're building something that I think software is easier to build. You're building something that focuses on hardware, requires physical kind of like, robots to test and look at. Any advice for like, the next kind of 19-year-old Dave who's
software is easy to build in New Zealand. You're totally right. I think working with hardware is only marginally harder because you can bring the hardware here and work with it. I think building hardware gets harder, and that's more a question of access to great resources. And if you look at something like Outset Ventures, it's kind of equipping deep tech companies that need physical things and labs and those kinds of things. So I think there's specialist VCs that are actually helping that ecosystem. We actually saw that in Silicon Valley where there were specialist hardware robotic startup companies like Lemnos Labs, which is like, hey, we've got a warehouse, we've got machining tools, we've got 3D printers, it's ready to go. 19-year-old walks in, starts their vision. And because they're in that ecosystem, they can access the specialists. That's like, when you're ready to mass produce this robot, don't go and spend 10 years trying to figure out how to do manufacturing. It's like, we know this person that's done manufacturing. They can just get that sorted. So I think that's in New Zealand, it's at what phase is the company? And I think New Zealand historically there's not a lot of people that know how to mass produce hardware. There are some, there's Fisher and Paykel's of the world, but a lot of the stuff, even like the Rocket Labs, is very slow, small run type of production, highly specialized. It's not mass produced. But then there are, electronics companies and radio companies that have done some of that. So I think that's where you're going to run into some challenges. But then it's that, get a group of VCs that have deep experience in those areas, and they can, so what if you're working with somebody from another country that's going to help you scale up your manufacturing? That's the way of the world.
Yeah. So your advice would be to just kind of start building in New Zealand and then see where it takes you, work with global experts whenever you can.
Yeah, I think it's like your question around how you pick your startup. Sometimes you pick it because you're interested in it, and you kind of just filter out the fact that it needs to be viable and interesting to you and investors at the end of the day. And I think a choice like being in New Zealand is very few entrepreneurs have the privilege of saying, well, this is the startup idea, therefore I should move to this city and do it there. Very few people get to do that. Most people are, my family and I choose to live here, and that's a constraint. And so, so, is it viable to do a startup in New Zealand? Absolutely. If you were in San Francisco, would it be a bit easier? Probably, So it's just that whole thing of, and the other things that are a little bit easier, you might even find earlier stage companies are easier in New Zealand than overseas because there's a really strong angel and startup, community here, particularly in Auckland. But then later stage, the good news is they can stream you into the later stage investors, and they're incredibly supportive and have channels of doing that. But yeah, pros and cons. It's always hard being far away from your customer. I think that's the one challenge. And often with these kind of startups, your customer is not in New Zealand. Like we had no customers in New Zealand. It's all the customers that were big enough and had big enough problems were overseas, and you basically have to get on a plane and go and visit them. But if you're in San Francisco, your customers may not be there, but maybe it's a bit closer to Europe and it's a bit closer to Houston or something to that effect.
Yeah,
but
no, just have to love flying a lot so that you can fly around the world.
You just have to get used to it. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really, really fascinating. And I hope, we get to humanoid robots very soon. But no, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.